time for some lizards to make like trees and bark. I've been doing some two-color color schemes based on magical elements, and I've done Ice and Fire already, which I'll link to in the description. But continuing with the elements, I got asked a curious question. What kind of earth would I be going for? Something about life or the ground? Well, I have to shrug my shoulders to that and say, why not both? This little series is focused on the Saurian Starhost from OnePageRules. I find their scales and their sci-fi armor to be the perfect split point between what can be two very vibrant colors. This time though, it's going to be all about texture, turning a giant gator into a tree and this little Gecko Sniper into a mossy stone. Any good tree has to start with the leaves, which means green. So I've got phthalo green on my palette along with red oxide and yellow oxide, because I want to manipulate this green back and forth through the shades a bit. Starting with my main base color, using the red oxide and yellow to get a neutral opaque green, which becomes color number 1, earmarked for this big guy's scales, just giving them all a solid foundation of this now opaque green. I want to do a little wet blending trick now, but it's of the simple variety, so don't worry too much. But this guy is so huge that one solid color might get a little, well, bland. So the question becomes, how can I introduce a bit of variety while keeping it a two-color scheme? And the answer is with a very subtle and easy hue shift. I'll need the red oxide and phthalo green again, but also some black to make two washes. One will just be the red oxide on its own, and the other will be the green with a bit of black, just to darken it slightly, but not extremely. I want both at the same time because the plan is going to be to blend between them for my wash layer. I'll start with the red oxide wash towards the center of his body, and while it's still wet, introduce the green wash on the other side. Then in the middle, while they're both still wet, blend them together. Since these are going to be in the crevices, it's not going to be a big deal how great the blend is, just that there is a bit of one. And since this guy's pretty big and acrylics are fickle, work in sections instead of overall, so a single arm or leg at a time. Something like this can also easily be done with diluted contrast paints or inks. The important thing to take away from this step is that it can be easy and fun to blend washes with very little risk, since it's only for the shadows anyway. For highlighting, it's just going to be a mix of the yellow oxide and the phthalo green, with a bit of my matte medium to dilute it out a bit. I want to have a bit of fun with textures, and this one might depend on the shape of the brush you use. While normally I prefer brushes like this that have a very long, thin point, this time I want to use something more teardrop shaped, because I'm going to stipple, but I want the stipple to be in the shape of leaves. So instead of poking the tip down on the model with the brush perpendicular, I'm going to hold the brush parallel instead and uniformly stamp little leaf shapes into the scales where the highlights need to be. I'll just add a bit more yellow oxide to the green and do some more leaf stamp stippling, but this time just in the places I want light to catch to finish off his green scales. So on rounded muscles and light catching areas. Now that I've got the leaves, I need the bark, which is going to be my second color of this guy's two-color color scheme, brown. Starting with something pretty dark, so I've got black, red oxide, and burnt umber for my starting selection of paint. I want to start dark and quite reddish, so mix the red into the umber, then darken it further with the black. The good news is, this should be quite opaque, and I'll use it to cover all of his armor. I want to make sure this is a solid coat too, since I won't be doing any washes over this one. For my next color, I want to texture the heck out of this, but in a weird way, because I do physically want it to look like bark and not just the colors of bark. So I'm using a pure raw sienna and only mixing it with a good amount of matte medium, because the secret to this is actually going to be the transparency. I'm going to stipple this color along the plates in lines, sometimes crossing over into other lines, but otherwise staying in a formation. As it dries, the little pools of stippled pigment should dry with some opaque and some not so opaque areas. I'll do another layer which will further texture and hide some of the uniformity of the first stipple. This pattern of opaque versus transparent spots will be important for my next step. I'm only going to add some white to the palette now and make a light brown out of the white, the umber, and the sienna, but also adding quite a bit of the medium again for a transparent mix. And this is where the texture from the last step will really come in handy, because I'm going to go through my texture and pick out all those opaque spots with this lighter brown, which should simulate some of the craggy texture of the tree bark. While I've got a lot of texture here, what I don't have is depth. It's all fairly uniform across the miniature, so I want to get some shadows and more color into the bark, and what better color to use than the one already doing that, red oxide, with some more thinner and medium. Not quite a wash, but a loose glaze. Using the brush damp with the mixture, I'll paint it into the pits and recesses of the bark in pretty wide areas, giving the light texture some red tint and creating shades where parts meet in the armor. If the gator is representing the big trees, then this little gecko is going to be the rocks. Unlike the big guy where I washed to get my split undercolors, I'm going to start this guy with split base coats. Using a black and white to make a dark gray at first, then adding red oxide to one side and phthalo green to the other to get two very different base coats. To apply it, this is where painting can become fun and chaotic. I'm just going to switch back and forth from one color to the other each time I head back to the palette to reload my brush, which should net me a very modeled base coat between the red and green. Now, it may seem like I just made a whole bunch of extra work for myself when it comes to highlighting, because now I have to highlight the colors individually, right? Well, not quite. I'm actually just going to grab more white and some medium, and then take a sample from each of the red and the green and mix them together, giving me the average of the two colors, but lighter. With this, I'll start to fill in most of the scales, and on his flat tail, stipple in a texture instead, so that he looks like a rock even where he's a bit flat. With the diluted gray, much of my base coat should still peek through. For the third highlight, just a bit more white into the mix, giving me a light gray. Then I'll just pick out edges and reflection points on the scales, mostly just stippling to keep the texture, but lighten up the areas where highlights generally go. Focusing a bit more on smaller stipples, with 2 in each of the sculpted scales in those highlight areas. The scales on his shoulders here provide a bit of an opportunity to add some variation as well. Since they seem like large stones themselves, why not paint them a bit different too? Something like gemstones might be fun, but because his armors is going to be quite a bit colorful, I think an obsidian would be good as well. Starting from black and just adding a bit of white to pick out the edges and give them some sharpness. I figure the best second color might be to make our little stone a mossy one, so I've got to get all his armor green. Just phthalo green is a bit too transparent to be a base coat, so this will be a 2-step base coat, adding white and yellow oxide into the green to opacify it. This should make it a lot easier to fill in all the little sniper's armor. Then when that's all filled in, add just a bit of the yellow and forego the white for a darker shade, but still vibrant green, and rebase over that more opaque base that I just put down. To represent moss, it's probably a pretty easy stipple, but I feel like to make it interesting, I want a color change from green to yellow for a very spring-like moss. So from my second base layer, I'm just going to add more of the yellow oxide for a medium tone. Then without much or any medium, stipple this all over the armor in a way that leaves much of the shadows alone, but gives a nice overall texture to the gecko's armor. Now I just have to take this concept and run with it until I'm getting a pure yellow. So just a few more steps were in between, but now I'm going to stipple edge highlight. Since his plate is quite flat, it makes sense to get those edges, but to do a line would kind of ruin the feel of it being a moss. So by using the edge of the brush like I would for an edge highlight, but breaking it up into spots instead of a swipe, I'll keep my texture, but get my highlight. I did add a few metallic highlights on the Gator with some gold, since I figured that was still in character for the Saurians, and he had enough extra bling to warrant the extra color. The one thing I will say about my process for both of these minis is that even for being simple with just 2 overall colors, the texturing over the large surfaces did take quite a long time. So that has to be weighed against whether or not the effect was worth it. And I can confidently say I've never done anything like this before. And to me, just the journey of trying was worth it. Please subscribe if you like this video, and check the link in the description to my Discord where I talk all sorts of nonsense about miniatures painting, provide critique on paint jobs, and occasionally stream.